First things first, how can we keep the environmental agenda in times of crisis? A very warm welcome to those of you who have joined us for this event here at the International Environment House in Geneva, UNEP's home in Geneva, UNEP's home in the European and Central Asia region. Also a very warm welcome to those of you who have joined us online. It's a real pleasure to welcome you for this event, which is part of a series of events celebrating, it's actually hard to believe, GEN's 25th anniversary. And Diana and the colleagues running the Geneva Environment Network have organized a series of very, very exciting events to celebrate this anniversary. The anniversary will culminate with a high-level event in January next year. And so we are really pleased to welcome you to this event and looking at the practices, strategies that allow us, have allowed us, and hopefully will allow us in the future to keep the environmental agenda as a key priority for the UN's work and for the international community overall. We're discussing this topic, of course, also in the context of International Geneva, where the GEN plays a key role. And mentioning International Geneva and the GEN, I also have to mention Switzerland, because there would be no GEN without the support of our host government. So we're really, really grateful that you have supported the GEN for all this time and that you're also joining us here today for this important discussion. Today's event is co-organized with the Global Governance Center at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and we will hear about a study, a research project that looks exactly at what happens with the environmental agenda in the view of the many crises that we're facing, particularly looking back a couple years to the COVID-19 pandemic and how this crisis has shaped the strategies and practices that the UN system and member states and stakeholders have employed to keep the environmental agenda as a key priority. Now, my own personal reflections at the outset of this meeting, looking back at COVID-19 and other crises, is that, of course, the environment itself holds a mirror up to all of us and shows us that we're living also in a world of environmental crisis. We're living in a world of a triple environmental crisis of climate change, nature and land loss, and pollution. And I believe COVID-19, but also other crises that we currently face, show us increasingly that solving the environmental crisis also has a direct impact on our ability to solve many of the other crises that we face. Just look at the relationship, if we're talking about COVID-19, between environment and health, right? And there the UN system has really responded in terms of its One Health agenda, in terms of making these linkages between zoonotics and how we treat our environment, how we reform, hopefully, our environmental practice, our economic practices in view of these environmental crises going forward. During this crisis, there has also been a lot of progress in terms of setting the environmental agenda globally. Just think about the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was largely negotiated during the pandemic, which shows that multilateralism can adapt. Multilateralism is able to react and adapt to the different situations it faces. And just recently, this multilateralism has received new energy through the adoption of the Pact for the Future. This multilateralism is without alternative, and this is also shown at present. We're having a very unique year, 2024, with 3 big conferences of the parties. We have just concluded COP16 under the Biodiversity Convention. As we meet here COP29 under the Climate Change Convention is happening in Baku, Azerbaijan. Later in the year, member states and stakeholders and the international community will also meet in Riyadh to discuss desertification. And hopefully this environmental multilateralism will have a very successful end to 2024, also through the adoption of an ambitious plastics treaty in Busan in Korea. So ladies and gentlemen, I would propose that we dive into the agenda for this meeting. We have with us a great panel of speakers representing member states, UN agencies, institutions, stakeholders, but we're also looking forward to your active participation in the discussion that will follow after the panelists have spoken. But first, I have mentioned the real cornerstone of this event is a research project undertaken by the Geneva Graduate Institute. So it's my real pleasure to welcome Professor Lucile Maertens. She is an associate professor and co-director in the Global Governance Center of the Geneva Graduate Institute. And she will present to us the first findings. I think the real presentation of the findings will happen early next year, but we're privileged to get a sneak peek into what this study and this research project have yielded so far. So Professor, let me hand it over to you, and we're looking forward to hearing about your research.
Thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. Thank you, Diana, for the organization of this event. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to present some of the intermediary findings of this research project, because I think the research project that has been framed in a way that is policy relevant. And so for me, it was really important that we have the opportunity to share some of the practices that we have been able to identify. And also because they could be of use in the future, but it's also a way to have your own feedback on our interpretations, because sometimes what you see from an academic eye might not be exactly the way that you will see it from a practice perspective. So having this dialogue is really important. So to introduce this project, I would like to go back to this caricature that I think you might all remember, which is something that we really seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, this idea that there is a form of inevitable competition, or at least comparison between crises, and one would be the most important one, first things first. This is really the starting point of this project, trying to understand the fact that there is overlapping and contrasting agendas, and especially tension between short-term and long-term priorities. And this has an implication on how international organizations are able to push the specific agenda, because if you work on a topic that has a long-term perspective, maybe it won't be seen as the priority when there is a crisis that is hitting us. And that led to this question: how do international organizations keep an issue which is not seen as a priority on the agenda in times of crisis? And that's what I've been documenting with my team. Some of them are around the table with us today. It's a 3-year research project that is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And what we've been looking at is more specifically the case of UN actors in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So how UN actors have tried to keep the environment on the agenda during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've been looking at a series of case studies, including some of them being around the table with us. So I'm really looking forward to have their own feedback on how we have studied their own activities. So we looked at the division working on environmental migration at the IOM. We looked at the UN Environment Program, mainly based on the discourses that the executive director has been delivering during the whole period of the pandemic. We looked at the operational activities of UNEP in Haiti. And so we've been also interacting at the more, I would say, operational level. We looked at the UN Secretary General and its climate agenda, and how he tried during the COVID pandemic to maintain attention on climate change, especially through the Build Back Better Together initiative. And as a side project, because I'm also working on the Swiss mandate at the UN Security Council, we also looked at how elected members at the Security Council have been able to maintain attention on climate change and climate security. And so what I want to present today is briefly the conceptualization of our main, I would say, output, which is the concept of agenda keeping. And then I will illustrate very briefly with some practices based on those case studies. So in the academic literature, we know a lot about how we set something on the agenda, how we want an issue to become a political issue or something that needs to be taken into account by political actors. But we know much less about how do we keep something on the agenda, and especially when there is a form of reshuffling of priorities. And so that's how the project has been focusing on what I have called agenda keeping, which I define as a process of maintaining a public issue among other competing public problems, a priority to act on. And what we have been able to identify based on the different case studies is that there's like 4 main strategies to which agenda keeping can unfold. The first one is by reframing, meaning that if you want an issue to stay on the agenda, you need to connect it with what's happening, basically. You can't be completely disconnected from the crisis. But at the same time, another strategy would be called positioning, because if you completely transform your issue so that it's completely connected to the crisis, you run the risk of not being distinguished enough, and that other actors will take up your own issue. And so that's why there's also a strategy about presenting the problem as distinctive, but still requiring attention despite the crisis. Then we have identified 2 strategies that are, I would say, more like connected to also the spatial temporality of what it means to have an agenda. And so the first one is to make sure that you can preserve space of deliberation, of advocacy, of decision making. And that's why I've called it space securing. And the last one is time ordering, which is the ability to prioritize action and to, in a way, challenge the rhythm and the pace that is imposed by the crisis. It's not because you have a crisis that we should completely stop working on what we have been working on for years, basically. And so all of these agenda keeping strategies have been, we have identified a series of practices, and I'm going to be showing them to you through different examples very briefly. So the first one that I mentioned, the reframing strategy, is really the one that we've seen in all cases. It's really the one that is the most, I would say, obvious one, because it's in the case of the pandemic, it was a way to make sure that we don't forget about, and this was part of your introduction, that there is a connection between the destruction of the environmental natural habitat and also zoonotic disease, for example, but in general health and global health. And so this is really the easiest strategy that we have observed. So for example, with these types of reports that are focusing on specifically zoonotic disease, and with also this idea that you can, it's actually by solving the ecological crisis that you can be able to prevent other crises from coming. Sometimes the reframing might not be so easy. And so in the case of IOM, because the connection between migration, environment, and then having also health and the pandemic was something that was maybe less obvious than the first link. And so what we have seen is that one strategy is to call for expertise, external expertise. And so you can see here, for example, when the IOM sent the call for submission, to be able to also try to see that connection. And this is a way for the organization to stay relevant, to make sure that they are not completely absorbed by the crisis. Another way to reframe is to connect what the crisis is actually doing in terms of, I would say, reinforcing the actual environmental problem. So in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, the focus, for example, on the plastic waste that has been very increasing because of the solutions that were applied for the crisis was actually a way to make sure that we don't forget about pollution, for example. And finally, you can also have this, and I think this was something that was really apparent in the case of the Secretary General, to focus on joint solutions, basically not only addressing one crisis, but actually trying to make sense of different crises at the same time. So this is the first strategy that we have identified. But as I said, you need also to present the distinctive problems that require attention despite the crisis, so that it doesn't completely get integrated into the crisis management, and to make sure that priorities are not completely reordered in the long run. And so if you look at, for example, in this case, this was at the very beginning of the pandemic, when Antonio Guterres delivered this discourse where he recognized the importance of the COVID-19 pandemic, but emphasized the fact that there is another deep emergency, the planet unfolding environmental crisis. So it's a way to make sure that we don't forget about the crisis, the ecological crisis during the pandemic. But you can go even further. So if you look at the discourses of, in the case of UNEP, and in some of the discourses by Inger Andersen, it was really clear that the message was not only that there is another crisis, but that the triple planetary crisis could be costlier, deadlier than any pandemic, and that solving the ecological crisis will actually be the solution for any of those problems. And so you create, to make sure that the environment stay on the agenda, you make it the meta problem. You make it as the one that needs to be solved first to be able to solve the other ones. Moving to the second part of the strategy, the spatio-temporal one, if you look at space securing, so again, it's this ability to preserve spaces of advocacy, deliberation, decision-making. What we've seen is that you need to have spaces that are both symbolic and material to continue working on the issue. And so sometimes it even means creating new spaces. And so the first, I think, sign of this is when UNEP say from the very beginning of the pandemic that we are still open for business. It's not because there's a pandemic that we're going to stop working. So the space of deliberation that we're creating so far, the space of advocacy, are still open for business. In the case of UNEP in Haiti, this has also a very concrete dimension, making sure that the staff can work. So making sure that you have all the necessary materials that you can work despite lockdowns. There's also all the strategies about creating new spaces. So new spaces can be online spaces, all those webinars that have been created to make sure that we still talk about the environment while we were still all in lockdowns. But you can also have a strategy of displacing action. And this is in the case of the UN Security Council. What we've seen is that because of the polarization within the Security Council, you can still have the conversation about climate security, but slightly on the side of the Security Council room. So for example, by creating an informal expert group on climate security to make sure that you continue the conversation even when the place is actually not the most favorable one at the time. And this case is not only about the COVID, even though like in the first image you see there, it's a online meeting that was organized to make sure that we can still talk about climate security. But I'll come back to it a bit later. And finally, so the final strategy, time ordering, is really about making sure that you challenge the pace and the rhythm imposed by the crisis, so that you are still able to prioritize action on the environment. Because you need space, that's for sure, but you also need actors to have time to invest and engage into spaces. It's not only about having the arenas. We need to have stakeholders having the opportunity to go there and take decisions. And so to avoid that decisions are not completely stopped, one of the first strategies that we've seen is just avoid postponing. So I take the example of the COP26. So you think it might be a counterintuitive example because the COP has been postponed. But actually what's interesting in this case is that even though the meeting by itself was postponed, some of the commitments that were asked to member states were not. And it was the case for not postponing the NDC deadline, and so make sure that climate action will not be completely delayed by the pandemic. This time ordering also takes the shape of being able to maintain a sense of urgency. Yes, we need to save the lives of the people that are suffering from the pandemic, but that doesn't mean that there is not another urgency in tackling climate change. And that was really part of what the Secretary General, with its now or never motto, the make or break moment of the planet, that has been really pushed. And I think what is also interesting in this last strategy is that it's not only about acting, making sure that we still do something, but sometimes even pushing for an acceleration. And that has been also something that UNEP's discourse have been trying to emphasize, that saying that we can actually take this pandemic as an opportunity to speed up action on climate change, on the triple planetary crisis, by using the pandemic recovery as an opportunity. So I think now I presented to you all these different strategies. The question will remain that which one worked actually. So this kind of, I think it's the next step of the study. I don't have definitive answers for that. I think it's very contextual based. In some organizations, we've seen that some practices have been more effective than others. But what we have been able to identify is that some practices or strategies will be adopted differently depending on the organization. So, for example, the internationalization characteristics as a strong I say influence on which strategy you can use. The more you're autonomous, the more you're able to, for example, act a bit in a more competitive way. If you have a mandate that is of general purpose, it's easier to do reframing because you are already working on different topics. But if you have a very specific mandate, issue-specific mandate, maybe you will engage more in positioning. Then the question is not only about the organization that is implementing these practices, but also the issue and the crisis that is at stake. Because basically nothing specific, like what I'm showing you, it's been done for decades. It's not specific to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're just trying to make sense of this, but it's not new that actors have been trying to fight against crisis and being able to make sure that their topics stay relevant. But then what I think is important here is to be able to identify which crises are easier to connect to. And so if you look at what's happening in the world today, for example, drawing attention to the ecological damage of armed conflicts is a way to keep the environment on the agenda while we're still focusing on war. Or when you look at biodiversity loss as a challenge that is much more important to our food system, to any economic crisis in the long run, it's always a way also to make sure that you connect to another crisis. And finally, and this is going to be a way to open also the discussion with our speakers, is what is specific with the environment because I think the practices that we identify could work for other topics like women's rights, for example. How do you make sure that we don't forget about women's rights in armed conflicts, for example? Or the protection of cultural heritage, for example, is something that also has to be maintained on the agenda. But is there not something specific about the environment because of the scope and the temporal horizon of the ecological crisis? I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Maertens, for this very, very interesting and fascinating insights into the strategies and practices that can keep the agenda in terms of crisis. You mentioned that perhaps looking at these strategies, practices can open opportunities to improve the agenda, but also looking beyond the immediate agenda and looking at multilateralism more broadly. How does the international community deal with crisis with multiple diverging priorities? And you also mentioned the actors that make these strategies and these practices work. And I think that's a fantastic segue to open up the discussion among our panelists. Ambassador Turney, You are the Deputy Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the UN here in Geneva. You're also the head of the multilateral division in the Swiss mission. You are representing the member state perspective on this panel, aside from, as I have said, being the driving supporter of the GEN. And I tend to believe also platforms like the GEN can help to keep an agenda in times of crisis, and I think the GEN has done that during the COVID pandemic. What are your reactions to what you have heard from Professor Maertens?
Thank you very much. First of all, and good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here at the Maison de l'Environnement with you this morning. I'm also with my colleague, Nicolas Lanza, who is the specialist on the question of environment at the Swiss mission. And it's a pleasure to be here to celebrate first the 25th anniversary of the GEN, a very important organization. And I thank you also, Director, for your invitation. I was very impressed by the presentation that you gave, Professor Maertens, on this specific topic. I had the impression that you have already moved from academics to practice and even diplomacy, according to what I heard. I will give you a few remarks on the question, first of all, of the general framework where we are working on. That means where we stand in terms of the situation, in terms of international relations. You know that, but I think it's important to reframe again the working space where we are working on. And then I will make a few remarks on, of course, the priorities of Switzerland on climate action, the role of Geneva in terms of how we can better combine our efforts, then move to the role also and our appreciation on the question of the role of UNEP and GEN in this specific context, and then some remarks on of conclusion. So yes, you mentioned, first of all, I think to keep the UN environment agenda in terms of crisis and your study, it's very timely, as we are living in a very specific time with important geopolitical tensions, a tighter budget also, and recurrent questioning and also pushbacks in terms of multilateralism. So yes, we are living in a time where multilateralism is under pressure or even under attack. It's sometimes some actors think this is easier to conclude bilateral agreements or to have transactional dealings instead of trying to find consensus and compromises. So this is a world order where many things are under pressure, but nevertheless, multilateralism is always the platform and the way that where we can find together solutions. That's of course is available for a question on environment, but also many other questions. The second factor that has to be kept into mind is that populism is also on the rise. Fake news is very important, and this is I will come back to the question later. I think fact-based and science-based analysis and the policies is very important in this framework. But also, I think we have to consider the fact that the question of purchasing power, inflation, is directly affecting, of course, many citizens, many population in the world, and this is something that might also or has to be taken into account when we format or think about how we can put back the environment agenda back on the first side of the scenario. At the same time, I think we cannot just dismiss the three crises that we are living in, and especially the global crisis of climate change. That means the fact that temperature increases, the biodiversity loss that we are living, and also the rising sea levels. All these factors have to be taken into account, and I'm very glad that you your study is bringing that back to the fore. It's very important. So what are Switzerland's priorities for climate action in this context? To come to my first point, we have first defined a foreign policy strategy for 2024 to 2027, which also emphasizes the need to address climate change, biodiversity, pollution, underscoring also the need for a consistent approach to global sustainability. So this dimension is very high on the agenda of Switzerland. And as you mentioned already, we have put the question of climate security as one of the 4 priorities that we had during our tenure as member of the Security Council, which will finish in December. And we have had many actions also in this segment of climate security. So it's possible for states to define climate security, climate change as priorities according to to their of course wishes, but also as a way to support the agenda on environment. And then I would like to mention that Switzerland also champions efficient global environment regimes, collaborating closely with UNEP and other stakeholders to guide effective, consistent solutions that benefit to all. And the third point, which is important for Switzerland as a host state, you mentioned that, also director in Geneva, we also support as much as we can the fact that organizations can settle down in Geneva, but not only international organizations in charge of environment, but also NGOs, civil society. So we open as much as possible the spaces for those dialogues to take place as the host state in Geneva. That concerns, of course, environment, but also trade, health, labor, human rights, humanitarian affairs. And you mentioned all those questions are really important to keep the environment agenda up on our agenda. Second point, Geneva role in driving the environmental solutions. We have here in Geneva organizations which are science-based. You mentioned them. So UNEP, first of all, IUCN, WMO, and other organizations. I'm thinking about also Santiago Network. So many organizations are working on science and deliver their outputs and have exchanges on the basis of scientific facts. And this is very important. So they produce reliable data, which are essential for crafting effective policies. Those organizations are also in Geneva and are offering research, dialogue, also taking part in different exchanges that are pushing for consensus. This is exactly the essence of multilateralism, and those are often the same organization that I mentioned, UNEP, IUCN, WMO, but also many others not directly involved in environment. Also through the Geneva Environment Network, we have a way to amplify these voices simply by the fact that the GEN is working with so many actors. So this is a possibility really to amplify these reflections. And then you mentioned also this fact. Geneva is a unique position also at the intersection of many different topics: environment, health, trade, human rights, humanitarian affairs, to provide leverage needed to mainstream these environmental priorities. But also you mentioned that, and I'm very glad that you mentioned the fact that the disarmament affairs, more hard policy discussions are also important, because disarmament is also helping for preserving the environment. And I think this is important that we have also the diplomats or the practitioners working in disarmament aware of environmental challenges and able to interact on those discussions. We mentioned, of course, the fact of Ukraine. This is a very specific places. We know how important, for example, is the fact that we are active on humanitarian disarmament, especially demining. And it has an effect on, of course, on socio-economic benefits for the citizens, but also in trying to keep the environment safe. Then I come to my last point. This is the question of the role of UNEP and the GEN in times of geopolitical tension and financial strain. This is important that we have such partners as you, the UNEP and the GEN, and your commitment is very important. UNEP is for us the authoritative voice guiding global policy with science-based insight, as I said. UNEP has a key role to play in Geneva to engage with all relevant actors, from science to policy and to action. And you play an instrumental role by offering scientific analysis, political advocacy, and also on-the-ground support. The GEN is also very crucial, very important. We see the GEN as the convening arm for the UNEP in Geneva. It's a place where we can meet, we can share ideas, and then further advocate for the important priorities that we have. It is important that we, excuse me, that we see the GEN as, I will take a little bit of water. Yes, this is important that we see also the GEN as a platform which not only links government or governmental bodies or intergovernmental bodies, but also academic institutions, private sectors, and other which are interested by the topic. And then also to mention that the GEN has been also instrumental in what you have described as the COVID crisis, because you have been also looking at the impact of COVID on environment negotiations, and also the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues that started during the COVID crisis to keep the momentum. So we have been also active in this topic. So the GEN has been, yes, quite instrumental. Exactly at the moment where we are finalizing now the negotiation on the plastic treaty. To close, to bring some conclusion to the topic and my intervention, and I can come back, of course, in the discussion on specific points that I made. I think there is still potential to increase the cooperation and the visibility for UNEP and for the environmental agenda. Even though multilateralism is under pressure, even though sometimes environmental policies are not always very popular, but it's a need. I think we cannot escape working with this very large crisis. I think also that we can relate to what you have mentioned. This is the Pact for the Futures, where 2 specific actions are dedicated to the question of environment. And if I'm not wrong, the first one, this is Action 9, which say we will strengthen our action to address climate change, and then Action 10, saying we will accelerate our efforts to restore, protect, conserve, and sustainably use environment. So this is very important, what has been achieved in New York last September with the adoption of the pact, because this is a further commitment first to multilateralism in many different parts of, I would say, areas. And I'm very glad that 2 actions have been also prominently taken in the pact. But further, I think this is a further commitment to working on a consensus, on consensus-based actions. But we need to remind the states and the stakeholders also that those actions have been taken. It's very good to take those actions and to commit, but then we have to implement. And I will finish with these remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. again for being here with us today, and for bringing in the perspectives from a member state, and helping through your voice as a member state and your actions as a member state, also helping us to shape these priorities and shape this overall environmental agenda. You have spoken to International Geneva. What a unique opportunity also this is for International Geneva. And that includes the GEN as a platform that can bring all these different actors together. So, many thanks again for being with us today, and for your commitment to this agenda, and for all your support to the GEN and all the other actors that make up International Geneva. Agi Veres is the UNDP representative here in Geneva. UNDP is a very close neighbor of UNEP here in Geneva, because we share the International Environment House. Mm-hmm. And so we have a lot of opportunity to talk with each other. But UNDP, for the purposes of this discussion here today, is of course an agency that is really at the center where all these different crises come together, because you deal with the development agenda. And so there is, I believe, not a single a crisis that the world faces that does not impact this agenda. Agi, can I also ask you for your perspectives and reflections on what you've heard?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the presentation, which was really enlightening, and for the ambassador's overarching kind of view on the topic. Because I think what I wanted to talk about is exactly a good segue then between that and the next speakers. Because I think even though you did not use UNDP as an example, in a way that's very good for this event, because I can share a few examples exactly along these lines to complement the study. And, from a UNDP's perspective, because we are not a single issue agency, because we are covering a number of development issues, this is, of course, really in the forefront of our thinking. So essentially, the study you did and the 4 areas that you looked at as the 4 agenda keeping strategies, I must say it's more or less our advocacy strategy. So our head of communication is here, so she may disagree with me. But when I was listening to you, I think, that's kind of what we try to do. When things are off the agenda, that's exactly what we're trying to do. How to position, how to use the existing platforms, how to use the spaces, how to bring it back into the forefront of policymakers' attention, and so forth. So I think it's extremely relevant. And the fact that you put some science behind it and some kind of analysis behind it is helpful for us as well to kind of think about it in a more structured way. So, as I said, UNDP is a little bit in a unique position in this course, because we are about integration, not just because this mandate is given to us. I don't like to refer to mandates rather than what we actually do and capacity we have. But essentially, we do bring integrated actions together with a focus on systems, how systems fit together and how they actually interact. So when we talk about climate, when we talk about biodiversity, COVID-19, the Ukraine crisis, we do feel it on our skin every day, this competition between the different policy areas, not just from the perspective of attention from politicians, which then translates into resources, but also in terms of our ability and the space we operate in that allows us to actually address these issues. But when we do address these issues, we have to do them hand in hand. So that's why I think what you presented is extremely relevant, because you cannot call attention to a topic in today's world as a standalone issue. It just doesn't work, not just from an attention perspective, but then from an action and response perspective. So allow me to maybe just follow a little bit your logic and then add to it, or the study that you presented to us. So in line with the tactic of reframing, you used the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll also use that a little bit in terms of a more integrated agenda. So UNDP very much focused almost immediately on the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19, especially middle-income countries. What does that mean in terms of jobs? What does that mean for the kind of the middle of society that was kind of okay before COVID, but didn't necessarily have the social safety net, so suddenly actually became into a much worse category. So when we were looking at the response, we were very much looking at the green pillar. So not just to rebuild or respond to this socioeconomic crisis, but respond to it in a green way. How can we help societies recover, but greener and more sustainable? So it really went hand in hand. And we really looked at it as an opportunity to, as you presented, COVID-19 took over everything and suddenly climate disappeared from our radar screen as if, somehow it was solved from one day to another. But, when we were looking at the response, we saw that as an opportunity. Actually, it is an opportunity because on one hand, it was shown to the world that you can reduce emissions, you can make blue skies in Beijing and so forth. So, why don't we use that experience, however unusual and let's say negative it was in many ways, but why don't we use that experience and turn it into actions that reflect that ambition and respond in an integrated way. Also, if I can use today's crisis that takes over a lot of attention, Ukraine and of course the Middle East. In Ukraine, we work very closely with UNEP and the other agencies to make sure that, when we are doing the crisis response, when hopefully and eventually we will start on reconstruction, it is, while the central issue is the crisis response, it's really reframed around sustainable rebuilding, aligning long-term climate goals, and putting the whole kind of sustainable energy also in the center of it, because that relates very much to the root causes of the conflict as well. So just to give you, I think, a very innovative example from Ukraine, as many of you know, especially if you have participated at the Mine Action Conference a few weeks ago in Lausanne, about 3.5 times of the size of Switzerland right now is spread with mines and explosives in Ukraine. That's an enormous area if you think about it. And this is the breadbasket of Europe. This is also something that could address the energy crisis of Europe. So, for example, one of the innovative solutions we're looking at, it's not just the cost, but it's also the speed of demining, is how we can bring public and private partnerships towards addressing the mine issue, but also towards addressing the ambitions of greening. So we have now a large program where essentially with the support and funding resources and actions of private sector, they will help clean large areas of mine affected land, which then goes into production, but the scheme is set up in a way that it goes back to the private sector, who will then commit to put up solar panels in these areas and contribute to the energy mix of the country. So I think, there are a lot of innovative ways how we can think about it. And when we're doing this reframing, I think it's also important that it doesn't, and you didn't mention this, but I would add to it, that it doesn't sound business as usual, that it's not just a little bit of tweaking, but actually you bring in something new, something that is appealing, not just from a solutions perspective, but from an attention perspective as well. The second one was the positioning. And of course, this is what every agency tries to do. I mean, that's our mantra behind doors. How do we position UNDP in the Geneva setting is one of our of course, mandates in Geneva. But I think, if I take the global policy agenda and the topic of environment and climate that you were looking at, one of the interesting things that I think UNDP did after the COVID-19 crisis was exactly with the attempt to grab attentions. How do you position the issue back on the agenda, but in a very specific way? And how do you do that through connecting to a particular topic within that? And I would say that, you also have to be very specific on this, because if you just say positioning climate, that's a big topic. So what we did, just to give you an example, if those of you remember the Frankie campaign, the Don't Choose Extinction, then we did a little bit of an animation, a dinosaur walking into the General Assembly and essentially saying, we got extinct by meteorites, but what's your excuse for basically making yourselves extinct? If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's kind of fun. It's Blackjack is the voice on the English version, so it's also brings a little bit of a humor in there. But the point is, we were looking at the issue as one of the root causes is a surge in fossil fuel subsidies. So then, you use kind of an appealing way, an animation that can go viral on social media and elsewhere, and then, you know, bring the issue back on the agenda after COVID-19 or during those other crisis times, you can do that in a way that just grabs attention. So people at least think for a second, what can we do, and then offer solutions. On the downside, I think the issue with these positioning exercises, to be you know, also a bit self-critical and to be honest about it, is how do you follow up on it? Because it's nice to get attention, but what's the action behind? And I think, you know, this is where I must say many international organizations, the UN, sometimes is maybe not that successful, because you do have the attention, people are ready to go, but, you know, then what is that they can actually do? And this is where I think it's extremely important also to talk about interagency and interorganizational collaboration, because that is one way then to channel the actions to different in different avenues that maybe one organization cannot actually support. Then talking about the space securing, I think this is space securing, right? The Gen itself. So that's fantastic. And I think that has been maintained for a very long time, just given the anniversary. From our perspective, maybe the example I would like to give, since we're in Geneva, is about how we are kind of leveraging the opportunities of the Human Rights Council. Because the Human Rights Council is one of the biggest platforms in Geneva, where you really have all the member states present, all the other organizations. And because there are so many aspects of human rights, and of course, with the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment coming in, that gives a perfect opportunity and the hook to say, you know, this platform is not just about human rights violations as stereotypically kind of thought about, but it's really an opportunity to dig into very, very specific issues. So through this angle, we highlight these environmental crises intertwined with crisis of inequality, inextricably linked to the protection of fulfillment of human rights and sustainable development. So we do organize not just side events, but also I think what's very important is to bring the realities to policymakers. And that's what I would also say in terms of the space securing, is then how do you use that space? Are you just going to be an additional voice among the many and just saying the same from your vantage point, or are you going to bring in something, some value added? And from our perspective, the value added is how, for example, these policy decisions look in developing countries, and how then, you know, developing countries' realities can feed into these discussions and shape the policy making that's happening in platforms like the Human Rights Council or normative agendas. And then on the last one, on time ordering, you also mentioned the Pact of the Future Ambassador, and I think through convening multi-stakeholder events and platforms, and in line with this recommendation, we are also focusing in this intergenerational equity and engagement with the youth to enforce the urgency. So I think, you know, when we talk about time ordering, we also have to talk about kind of who is involved. And I don't want to use the word stakeholders, because it's really not about that in my mind, but it's really how we bring in future generations. And that is something that we need to get more serious about. I mean, my personal view, this is not necessarily a UNDP view, but I think we should have youth everywhere shadowing and accompanying every process in a meaningful way, not just a tag on the table saying youth, and there's one person in a room of 400 people, but somehow meaningfully involve them. And this is what we're also working on. And then, you know, going from the youth to in general kind of citizen action, it's also important that we look at how citizens can and how other parts of the society, other than those who are already well organized to participate in it, how they can also be part of that space. And just a little bit of an advertisement here. On the 2nd of December, together, of course, with the support of Jan, we are organizing a climate event in the Palais, which will look at citizen actions in terms of the different avenues that's available to them. So you're very welcome to come to that. So I'll close with that, because I think, you know, these examples also just the message I wanted to send with these examples, that I think this is not just the research, this is how we actually work. And by learning from this research, maybe we can also work better and be a little bit more structured around it. And it would be fantastic to see how those of you who are maybe kind of perceiving what international organizations do in this space, how does that work for you from an audience perspective? I think that's kind of the next step to see in terms of the effectiveness of these actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agi. I think you've really helped us to unpack the strategies and practices from the perspective of UNDP. And for me, it was interesting that you really spoke a lot about opportunities that these crises can also relate from your perspective in terms of bringing things together. You also highlighted action a lot, how important it is that we really have meaningful outcomes of the international community debating these agendas. And one of the realizations of a concern and the surrounding action are, of course, in the field of the environment, multilateral environmental agreements. Right? They have been created to respond to a crisis. And for UNEP, one key part of our presence here, as you all know, of course, is that we have also several secretariats of global multilateral environmental agreements here in the International Environment House. And David Ogden is the Deputy Executive Secretary of one of them. It's actually 3 agreements in one: the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, the BRS Secretariat. And David, looking back at COVID-19, what I remember is that waste management was a real topic that this pandemic highlighted, and how the BRS structure, system, mechanism has turned this discussion highlighted by COVID-19 into an opportunity. But what are your reflections on what you heard? How does this look from the perspective of BRS?
Thank you, Arnold. And I will get back to the point that you raised. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Jen on 25 years. When I started was 28 years ago, and the way we got the missions together is we had a big fax list and we faxed to everybody, and it was a real challenge. And now there's this great forum, which is the Gen, which has really helped us in our work, as I know for so many, and provided this really great place for the international community to meet in Geneva on environmental issues. So that's great. So I'll just kind of go through this. For us, of course, we were dealing with COVID as with everyone else in real time. And we have 2-year cycles with our Conference of the Parties. We have to keep things rolling. So that's the challenge, was how to keep things rolling during these years. So the main thing is, of course, we do a lot of planning. We usually do it on 2-year cycles, but then we have to continually revise to deal with the realities that we were dealing with. And so it's like you have plan A, plan B, plan C. You have to keep planning, adjusting. But in the process, I think we learned a lot that has been helpful longer term. And within BRS, of course, we have a business continuity plan, as others do in UNEP, and we were able to really implement this during the COVID. One thing we did was we said, well, let's try a day where we send everybody home and work from home for a day. Let's see if we can do that. And so we did it. And then the very next day, everything closed. So they just stayed out there. So that was good. And certainly tools like Microsoft Teams has been a real godsend for us. Our first focus was to maintain the Secretariat operations, that they were functional. And this meant moving so much of our work online. And we were able to do this. One of the challenges we have, since we deal with the whole world and the world is a round ball, sometimes it makes it very difficult to hold meetings, especially 8-hour meetings when your chair is from New Zealand and he's basically working with the night shift. But people have actually, especially from those sort of places that are so far away have been willing to do that. And I've been amazed at the commitment of people to say, yeah, I'm going to do this. And they'll work from midnight to 9 in the morning, and they'll do well. They'll chair meetings. It's been very satisfying to see how committed people are to our work, to our mission. In BRS, we have a crisis management team, which oversees how we're going to deal with the various crises that come up, and including when people can come back. People sometimes have to come into the office, little details like that. How are we going to return to the office? So this is has been a big part of keeping things going. It's always got to keep things going. We can't not be working, and I know everyone has faced that. And then we had to keep our parties and other partners informed of our activities and what to expect, because it was communication can be a challenge. One of the direct areas related to this is continuing the program of work. And so we've given out top priority to ensuring that this was done. Moving from face-to-face to online meetings, as I said, has been a challenge, and it's difficult to do as much as you could do in a face-to-face meeting, because remember, we're global treaties dealing with hazardous waste and chemicals. And so how do we actually ensure that everyone can be involved in this? Part of the challenge was having to, thank you. Part of the challenge is how do you prioritize issues within your agenda? Obviously, we work on 2-year budget cycles like most the UN does. And because of that, you have to get your budget adopted. If you don't get your budget adopted, then people don't get paid and the work comes to a complete halt. So in a sense, it sounds a bit self-serving, but if you can't keep the organization running, then the work isn't going to get done. So we had to do a lot of structuring of the budgets and how do we work the budgets. And even as we move away from COVID, we had to move some of the budget to the next biennium, which is a real challenge. But we managed to do that as well. And so we've had to have a coordinated sort of approach to dealing with voluntary funded activities, because many of the activities have come from donors and there were time deadlines associated with those. And so we had to work with the donors to extend the deadlines, because we were not able to do everything that was called for. And some things just have to be done on face-to-face and on the ground. So those were some challenges, but donors were very understanding, and we were able to manage that. One thing that we've done is obviously linking to the crisis is important, but also linking to, which are maybe you say higher visibility, maybe higher priority for some on the international agenda. So we were very careful to make sure we were linking to climate change, to biodiversity. And we're fortunate that chemicals are sort of a horizontal issue, so you'll find them in every sort of these other areas. So we were able to do that. And as mentioned, we also were able to link to COVID itself. And as Arnold mentioned, there was a big emphasis on dealing with waste, because one of the most significant impacts of COVID-19 pandemics for the conventions concerned waste management. Large volumes of potentially contaminated waste are generated by hospitals and other healthcare facilities. The volume of plastic waste, in particular for single-use plastic, surged, and other impacts are observed, a greater use of disinfectants and hand sanitizers. So the patterns of generation of domestic and commercial waste changed, and this has created a lot of challenges for governments. Within Basel Convention, we have a very flexible sort of approach to helping with waste management. We prepare, the governments prepare, the parties prepare technical guidelines on dealing with various waste management streams in an environmentally sound manner. So we certainly have redone the one we have for plastic waste, but also dealing with hospital and other healthcare waste. These have been revised and tend to be very useful for governments in dealing with these things. So at the end, I think our efforts paid off. We were able to keep things working, keep things moving. Things that we had to delay, but we've since caught up. And as I said, we've continued the linkage to these other environmental treaties, and that's been very, very useful. And I think another benefit was the innovation that came through COVID, which had to move us to other. Now we're not doing just all online, but a lot of it is hybrid now, as I imagine this meeting is as well, which is good if you only have a 1-day meeting and you're in New Zealand and we're having a 1-day meeting in Geneva. It'd be great if they could be here, but practically speaking, that's a lot to ask of anyone. So anyway, I think that's been important in terms of the strategies that resonate most with us that were prepared and were outlined in this very useful research. Of the four, I would say that during COVID-19 pandemic, we first implemented space securing and time ordering, and we ensured that our programs continue to run smoothly by shifting meetings and events from face-to-face to online and postponing when we had to, but generally speaking, we did not postpone very much at all, but it was good to have this sort of flexibility. We also implemented the reframing and repositioning strategies. We highlighted that the waste management was essential in the fight against COVID-19 and to minimize possible secondary impacts upon health and the environment. Thus, the cross-secretariat team focused on COVID and waste and was established, and together with our partners, which included UNEP and UNDP and others, we engaged in supporting parties in the critical response and resilience building process. So that's quite a bit. I won't go into too much more at this time. I think that in general, that this research really reflects a lot of what we've learned from our personal, our practical experience. And it's nice to actually see them sort of laid out there, and maybe it help us to sort of focus when the next crisis comes, which I hope is not too soon. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your perspectives. The work of our next panelist has, I think, already been mentioned in the introduction when Professor Maertens shared with us the preliminary findings. Dina Ionescu is now a senior international technical expert for asylum and migration at UNHCR. During the COVID pandemic, Dina, you were the head of migration, environment, and climate change at
within the asylum and migration work of UNHCR, and I started just a few weeks ago. So they are contesting. So what I would like to bring today, it's indeed that I was during the COVID crisis in charge of the migration, environment, and climate change work at IOM. And then I have worked just after also in the follow with the UNFCCC. I was seconded by IOM to the UNFCCC. So really on a climate agenda, and then with the climate vulnerable forum as well. So I looked at it from an organization that had a mandate on migration, or who did not have a mandate on environment, and then to organization that really dealt with climate issues as the centerpiece of their work. So I find that this research, it's extraordinary. I find it's a very good think to really reflect on what we've done and what we've learned and what we can do in the future based on that. So I have a few items that I thought through really from the IOM's perspective throughout the crisis, and my points connect very well with the framing you made. So for instance, the reframing general vision, it's very much connected to what I just wrote on with the keyword connecting. So connecting, it was IOM anyway, it's migration and something, always, it's embedded in the ADN. But there indeed, there was the triple nexus. So the word nexus really came very strongly in migration, environment, climate change, and then also health dimensions. And we tried really to frame the three key contemporary policy challenges together. And part of it was already in place. Part of it we really tried to enhance. And it was very difficult internally for us, in fact, to put pressure on the colleagues who were working on health and migration, because that was the first step. We went first, health and migration, we are environment and migration, and let's work together. But they were under huge pressure. So it was extremely tough for them to also take into account, okay, let's also use climate. And so that was one first step in this hybrid kind of approach. And I know you use this word also of hybridization process. And I think what we then saw out of this, it's indeed to get more knowledge, more research, hence this blog series that we launched, which was an appeal to a lot of knowledge from outside. And in fact, some of the research, it's exceptional, and I think you should really look at it. It's still online, and a lot of the research you saw there took areas that develop now and that are even more important now. And I will quote a few of them. We even tried to sense of humor to push for this with a tricky name that was not allowed institutionally to be used for research. And I'm going to just say it nevertheless. We tried with François Gemène and his team to have a research piece called Ménage à trois. And we were not allowed to do that, to use the title. So you will see, if you look on the blog series, it has an extremely elegant name, the research. But that brings me to connecting from the keyword, connecting to the word, I think it's enhancing. So in the reframing, there is also what you are saying about positioning and space securing and reframing in one. We try to enhance, because the crisis highlighted extremely important, really key issues in migration. So for instance, immobility, trapped population, when you can't have migration, and the impact on health, in particular in camps for displaced population. So there was a strong focus that now I think the IOM took much further now. Then there is the question, for instance, of cities moving internally to spaces that are not secure, and that highlighted really the issue of inequality of access of migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons to different services, and in particular health services. So that was one important one. And that's a topic that grew now, and where there's much more work now on that. Then also very interesting, more work on seasonal migration and explaining that migration in times of crisis, it's not only displacement issues, but that it's the strategies of migration that are the most common seasonal strategies of migration are put into question by the crisis, but also by the climate change impacts, because seasonal migration is directly connected to all the environmental issues. Then it helped us also highlight environmental issues much more, in particular access to water resources and food security issues. So everything framing the human security dimension in a way. Others domain, I think, grew. I would like to mention mental health, that I think it's
has really developed also through the crisis in connection with mental health in relation to eco-anxiety issues. And that I think it's a key space of research far beyond, of course, IOM. So from IOM side, what I wanted to also mention is how we try to translate and reframe and revise our activities. So what was, sorry, I'm also having a, what was like planned to be policy dialogues at regional level. That was a very strong focus of the migration and environment and climate change agenda, IGAD, West Africa, the Pacific. That could not happen in person. So it has been a lot refrained in more research, and the fruits are now at policy level because, for instance, the Pacific has a new framework on migration, mobility, and climate. So it has really had an impact, but post-crisis, because we went out of the COVID, I think. Another key thing that was mentioned before, and I want really to mention, is how practical the whole thing is. So IOM, it's a project organization. So a lot of activities go through projects. So we had a lot of work to do in working with our donors, with our colleagues, and inside the organization at admin level. What a nightmare to review all lines, admin lines, so that project can continue, can be renewed, people can be paid. So huge investment at a human level and admin level, and working with colleagues across the world to maintain also our solidarity and joint vision. So from my side, that I think there are quite a number of things that emerge. Then from UNFCCC side, the Climate Convention, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, also loads of interesting things to consider. For instance, the power of very vulnerable countries to climate change, stronger voice, enhanced maybe through the focus between climate and health, and with the link with the environment. And as an example, the Climate Vulnerable Monitor research done with Lancet, between also the Climate Vulnerable Forum, with contribution also support with IOM, with UNFCCC, and with WHO. There's a whole research there that's extremely interesting, that has a lot of heat, wildfire, infectious disease, food security, all climate risks and health risks connected together. And we had a big event post crisis, COVID crisis, about that. So there as well, there was a lot of interesting adjustments happening and enhancement. Then I would say there's resistance also, a lot of resistance from colleagues, from the leaders, from staff, from donors, to just maintain issues on the agenda in solidarity. So I think that's very important. Another important area, I think, that was mentioned before, it's creating new spaces. So I think for IOM, it was key to showcase that less movement meant reduced footprint at the environmental level, and a lot of reflection also on waste and clean energy went on. So that also, I think, merits to be considered in the framework that you put so eloquently together. And to finish, I would say, to come back to now to my new functions, I discussed with Andrew Harper, who is the climate envoy of the High Commissioner, that I was going to this event. And so he told me, what does it mean to be on the agenda? Because of course I was saying, okay, so we had an exchange on what does it mean? Is it just that we talk about and communicate? Is it just that we research about just? Is it policy? Is it communication? Is it social media? Is it trainings? Is it operation? And is it money? Is it funding? So he told me, you have to say, no, not enough action. That action means that things are on the agenda. So how do we translate also everything research? It's a key question on translating into operations, of course. And then I would like to end on a point that's more personal, because for me, this whole research and topic raised really, and this experience raised very strong, almost, I don't know, moral, philosophical, personal, emotional questions. Because I saw a whole strand of communication on reducing, in fact, freedoms and restraining individual mobility and the right to movement as also a way to say, look, if we do this, we could do this for the environment. So it raises in me a big question on how we transform this so that it's not contradictory. And I think it's a good transition maybe to Sébastien on human rights and mobility as a human right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. We are connecting and enhancing, including through the microphone. I think you've created a very nice segue to our last panelist, Sébastien Duic. He's a senior attorney and campaign manager for human rights and climate at the Center for International Environmental Law. The human right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment has already been mentioned, but Sébastien, please do share your perspectives with us.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I will come back to this theme. I'd like to start, of course, congratulating Jen on its anniversary. I feel like what I would like to focus a little bit is on the importance of the Geneva International, the infrastructure that was established here before COVID, and to what extent it helped United Nations agencies, institutions, and then the different right holders, stakeholders around them to actually react and maintain issues on the agenda. So GEN is definitely an organization that's a project that plays such an important role in actually helping us foster those linkages. And I think it's actually very appropriate to have this conversation hosted by the GEN. And we speak about COVID a lot, but many of you have reminded us, of course, crises are not just pandemics. We have the crisis that multilateralism faces at the moment, whether it's due to recent elections and the threats to institutions that come with it, including in relation to funding and other issues that we know will come and will be hard for some of the institutions, but also in terms of the lack of credibility that some institutions have when it comes to actually protecting the universal project of human rights at the light of some of the conflicts ravaging some regions of the world, and in particular in Eastern Europe, Middle East, but also on other continents. So crises, yes, they are here, they are with us. The pandemic is one that we really are able to point a finger on, but let's not forget the other ones. From our perspective, maybe a note of hope also in terms of how we collectively, the United Nations institutions, but also other actors have been able to maintain issues on the agenda. I just wanted to recall two dates. 6th of February 2020, a first workshop was organized here in Geneva to discuss actually whether it was the right moment to recognize the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. On the 7th of October 2021, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution that recognized as a human rights the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. 18 months are separating those two dates. Those were the 18 months during which the pandemic was actually really at its strongest. And we could see so much progress actually happening at this time. On the 7th of October 2021, the Human Rights Council also established a new mandate for a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. So a lot of momentum was actually maintained, was sustained, and actually amplified over those 18 months time window. And really, 6th of February 2020, that's just a couple of weeks before Switzerland shuts down because of the pandemic. So things happened actually during this time, and I'll focus my remarks on the policy shaping not so much the implementation aspect of things, but a lot of things happen, and actually some very significant one. There I want to mention the role of UN agencies during these 18 months, in particular, for instance, the fact that 15 UN entities came out very strongly in favor of the recognition of a right to a healthy environment in February 2021, and really supported the efforts of other actors, whether states or civil society, to actually accelerate this path towards the recognition of a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. One issue that is particularly important from our perspective, and being the civil society speaker on the panel, I guess it will not surprise you, is the importance of recognizing the fact that agenda keeping or building strategies at United Nations forums really rely on three sets of partners: the UN institutions or processes that are there, and I think the study focuses a lot on it, the states that carry this agenda, and of course, civil society. And so there are some lessons that we would like to draw from COVID and the role of that civil society was unable to play. On one side, a lot of new modalities for participation. Some of you already mentioned it in the context of your work, that actually provide good practices, and we've kept building on those in terms of facilitating the participation of those on other continents. We mentioned time zones issues, but I wanted, for instance, to recall the fact that in June 2021, when we were participating to the subsidiary body on implementation and the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice of the UNFCCC, we had 3 weeks of sessions, and the meetings took place online at different time slots. One that was very appropriate for European, one for probably Americans, and one for Asian colleagues, and then forcing the others to actually just adjust their agenda. So there are ways to actually really conduct this virtual participation in a way that's as equitable as can be. But at the same time, there are also many challenges in relation to participation in time of crisis, public participation in time of crisis, and in particular in the context of virtual participations. Our experience is that our access to UN human rights bodies, in particular, for instance, treaty bodies, was very limited during the time. Our interactions with treaty body secretariats, treaty body members was made a lot more complicated, and that some of those new modalities have actually had a long-lasting impact beyond just the lack of access to the building themselves because of a pandemic. And so this is something for us also to be extremely careful to understand where did we backtrack or slide back in terms of public participation in institutions, and how do we make sure that some of those new modalities don't have such a long-lasting impact. At the same time, we have UN bodies based in Geneva also helping us understanding the implication between COVID and public participation. I just wanted to name, for instance, the statement of the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee on public participation both during COVID-19 pandemic and afterwards in the subsequent phase of economic recovery, that really helps governments understand actually what are the legal obligations that remain in terms of public participation in the context of such a crisis. There's just 2 final points to conclude, because I think we're running out of time. COVID clearly showed also the importance of cooperative solution. That's something other panelists have mentioned. It highlighted that resources are available to states when they really treat crises with the level of urgency required. And also it revealed the lack of global solidarity to a large extent, and the fact that some of the other crises do not receive the same level of attention when it comes to actually rolling our sleeves together and demonstrating the level of solidarity that is required to face those crises. Just today, negotiations are really struggling in Baku in relation to the new collective quantifiable goal for climate finance. And this is something that, of course, is in the back of the mind of many people. The trillions that were mobilized for the recovery in some countries, why can't we make those available when it comes to actually other crises? And when we have international legal principle that require us to do that. To conclude, just maybe really to come back to this point of factors, and maybe to encourage also the researcher to really integrate that dimension in their research. You mentioned ménage à trois, so I don't know if I will have dared to go that far, but I really, from our experience, we have those institutions, we have states, we have civil society, and these are the 3 actors that actually drive the international agendas. The institutions, they are so important, and again, Jen help us, and other processes like this help us actually really build synergies among institutions, including so that when a crisis comes, we have the resilience within the system. States are particularly important in relation to the right to a healthy clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We had 5 states at the forefront of these efforts. It shows that just a small number of states can really drive things. And I want to thank, of course, Costa Rica, the Maldives, Morocco, Slovenia, and Switzerland for their leadership. At the same time, when multilateralism is under attack, then it is particularly important for states not to undermine regional courts that work on environmental issues. And that's a message that I would like, of course, to pass to our Swiss hosts today. Civil society and indigenous people being the third actor, of course, very, very important when it comes to helping, supporting other actors, working in close partnership with other institutions. And during the pandemic, despite the actually success of a right to healthy, clean, healthy, and sustainable environments campaign, it was very difficult for us to actually manage to have this relation with permanent missions to really be able to do the work that sometimes will happen at the Serpent Bar in the Palais des Nations or in other locations where we can really work hands in hands. And so I'll just conclude here by inviting maybe really the researchers and anyone else interested in continuing this research that for sure will be needed in the future, unfortunately, given the crises that are ahead of us, to continue to focus also on the importance of strengthening resilience of institutions and the ability of multilateral organizations to deliver work, building on those different relationships between different actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Seb. Very important perspectives from civil society that you're representing on this panel today, but also about system resilience and how, a group of member states can actually, get things moving, even in times of crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, those were the panelists. I think looking at my watch, at least, with your permission, I would like to do a little bit of space securing and time ordering, if I'm allowed, because we need to hear from you. We have a lot of stakeholders of International Geneva here in the room. We have also participants joining us online. So now I would like to invite your perspectives with regards to what you've heard, and then maybe we can do a very quick fire roundup from the panelists, 10 seconds each, if that's agreeable, that we remain for a few minutes longer than was foreseen. Great. Then the floor is open. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Amrei Horsbrink. I'm a senior specialist with UNITA, UN Institute for Training and Research. And the presentation from the research team as well, the remarks from the panelists really resonates a lot with me. And I wanted to share 2 points also based on my experience and perhaps also further reflections as you continue your research. So I actually work on the Partnership for Action on Green Economy that also includes UNEP and UNDP. And, we came out of Rio +20, right, with this idea of, in a period of steady economic growth, that if you take a little bit of your GDP, right, and you invest that into green activities, this would really lead to job creation and economic growth, etc. Then the crisis hit, and I remember really that there was this really actually renewed positive energy among all of us, thinking that now, as you also pointed out, Agi, that, we would have this kind of green recovery, and there was this opportunity to redirect all these resources that were invested into sustainable infrastructure, renewing our transport systems in a greener way, etc., that would happen. But I think there was really this realization towards the end of the pandemic that things were not going into that direction, right? And I think that's perhaps also what you, Dina, meant by saying, it was on the agenda, the green recovery, but what was really the action? And I think UNEP actually did this tracking also of, how much of the recovery spending was going towards green activities, and perhaps with the exception of the Inflation Reduction Act, not much was actually going that way. So coming back to your research, I was actually thinking, if the situation today is not fundamentally different than, at the time of the crisis, there was like one crisis, right? I feel now there are multiple crises. There's also this crisis fatigue kind of, right? So I was wondering to what extent some of the, by the way, I think this is really useful as a framework, but I was just wondering, maybe just for your further thinking and also for us to further think how we can communicate. Because I must say, as part of, for example, this PAGE initiative, Partnership for Action Green Economy, we are looking for a new narrative, which is not so easy to find in this context of multiple crises and increasing uncertainties. So yeah, the other point I wanted to ask was more about to what extent, and maybe that came already out in some of the other contributions, but to what extent we can also be more proactive, because some of the strategies outlined here seem to be quite reactive, right? So here's the crisis, so how do we reframe, how do we position, etc. I think also the SG is calling really on us to kind of do more strategic foresight, right? Really plan for this type of situation. But that's really difficult actually to do. And what are some of the strategies here? We just did, we are working on our new strategic framework for UNITA, and we're just doing a strategic foresight retreat. When we looked at all the trends and things that could happen over the next years, nobody mentioned a global pandemic. It was all about, I mean, we spent like an hour doing the exercise, and at the end, nobody had thought about a new health emergency. It was all about, geopolitical tensions, potential war, etc. So we are so easily, also mentally focusing on what's happening right now. So I was just wondering also, as you do your research, what are some more of the kind of strategic foresight or anticipatory strategies we can adopt? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to have UNITAR's perspective as well. IUCN, please.
Work. Thank you so much. And actually following on, well, first, my name is Sonia Peña Moreno. I'm from IUCN. Neighbors, well, across in Gland, in Canton de Vaud. Just following up on what you were saying about, the connections in the agendas. IUCN had an initiative at the time of the pandemic that was called the Nature-Based Recovery Initiative. And it was precisely to put the lens on the importance of keeping on investing in nature conservation in a time of crisis with the pandemic unfolding. And we did so we frame it as an advocacy strategy, which is, it was a departure from IUCN's traditional way of doing work, because we're more on the science-based approach and very much on the policy influencing side, but not so much on the advocating and using, active communications to advocate for a position. But we did so because we wanted to pass on the message in a bold way. And the bold ask at the beginning was, in the recovery packages, we need to invest at least 10%. And we came out with, this percentage to push for something that was concrete yet aspirational, where we could drive our members that are both on the state side, government agencies, NGOs, civil society organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, to push for that sort of raising or increasing the ambition in terms of investing in nature-based recovery by investing on nature-based solutions, investment on, for instance, jobs in conservation, which yield more and better results longer term than investing only on traditional or conventional jobs, for instance, and giving also opportunities to women, communities, youth in this type of nature jobs. So restoration, for instance, restoration practices. We found, the narrative behind it made sense, and the message was passed. Our members were engaged. We had a number of webinars to pass on the message, had discussions, etc. But we face a lot of challenges in terms of priority settings and a pushback from many countries. When the narrative was there, the understanding was there, the rationale was clear, yet at the time of the decision making, then priority, environment or investment in nature went back down in the scale of importance. And also finding the data to back up the claim was hard because we couldn't reach all the cases in different parts of the world to say it is connected to you, it's connected to your reality. And if you invest in restoration jobs for the women in your community, that is going to yield back good results. And we couldn't find that immediate, sourcing of the evidence was very difficult. So making the claim was hard. But the advocacy strategy kept on being a very simple one: repeat the message, repeat, and keep the agenda of nature conservation and its imperative everywhere. One more comment from my side, and it's on the terms of the multiple crises that we talk about. One crisis that I think that we're facing at the moment is the one of trust, and a trust among the, if we can put it like that, and it's very black and white, but between the developing world and the developed world in terms of funding versus ambition, if you want. So on the developed country side, we see, and we saw it in Cali in the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting just now, you see the EU, for instance, making strong claims for keep the ambition high, keep going towards raising the bar, whereas on the developing world, you see the G77 and all the countries in development saying, yes, ambition, yes, okay, but we need to develop, we need the funding and your support in terms of funding to make that ambition happen. So you have that big divide. And it's one of, I don't trust you anymore. We've been saying this over and over again, and the messaging doesn't, pass from one side to the other. So I think it is important to reflect as a community, international community, how do we bridge that divide? How do we call for that consensus making in terms of decisions? And when we see, and also that's part of the crisis of trust, I would say, is the spaces for observers, like for instance, IUCN, to take the floor and say, parties, please, take a much bolder approach here, and let's decide for the benefit of the young generations and the good of all, something really concrete. They are closing up. So the spaces officially, of course, you can go and talk to the delegates themselves and approach them and have a conversation, etc. But to take the floor and say, this is for everyone. I think that we face it in the UN agencies, the intergovernmental organizations like us, civil society organizations, less and less spaces at the level of official. So that's another crisis that is linked to the one on multilateralism that we need to approach bang on and head on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One final perspective. The Gen team will tell me if there's a request from the floor online. There is not. Anybody else here in the room? Yes, back there, please. I think we need a microphone also for people joining us online. You could please come forward. Yes.
I grab one of these too. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for inviting an additional perspective. My name's Kirsten Hagen, and I work for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And great to be here and be part of this conversation. There were a couple of things and it was really useful, your framing of the different ways of keeping these items on the agenda, because from the humanitarian perspective, it had taken a lot of effort to get climate-related issues onto the agenda at all, and then COVID hit. And I felt like we had reached a little bit of a peak in terms of really getting interest, and then suddenly there was this risk that we were going to completely lose that interest within the humanitarian community. And so I think that what we tried to do as a humanitarian community was first to maintain momentum by creating actually new spaces and bringing the climate agenda into existing spaces, new spaces, and then finding some synergies to kind of move forward. So if you focus on disasters, which for us we do, our focus is on working with communities affected by disasters, the disaster risk management cycle, and you're seeing the impacts of climate change for many years, you cannot ignore it despite the pandemic. It just meant that the actual practical action of response was so much harder. and all of the issues that Dina raised in terms of access, mobility, and equity. All of these were affecting our ability to program. But what was actually interesting to me, hearing all these conversations around the challenges, is that it was actually in that time that we managed to build some new spaces for dialogue here in Geneva. So we actually established the Interagency Standing Committee, which is the humanitarian coordination mechanism, a climate change working group, right at when COVID basically began. And so we shifted everything online, but that space continued. And interestingly enough, it kept building. And so as the humanitarian community was seeing that despite their focus on COVID, the climate-fueled disasters was still hitting them and had to be dealt with, it actually became a more important conversation, I think, for many, and we were able to keep the momentum. At the same time, we also managed to get this issue of climate change onto the ISC principles. So that's all the heads of organizations talking about it, and to move forward on a climate charter for humanitarian organizations that now has some 400 signatories. So just thinking about what you were saying in terms of we actually somehow created a new space that ended up helping to really build the dialogue. The other reflection that I had was around some of the synergies between the climate and health agenda, which was really, I think, and COVID actually really helped to bring forward this really important issue around the intersection between health and climate change, which I think we weren't talking about enough. And so having attended a number of the COPs, the fact that there was finally this climate and health ministerial, you had health ministers talking about climate change. So actually the climate agenda got into their health ministers' heads in a way that hadn't happened before. And I think that having a health day, there was a health declaration that came out at the UAE COP last year. I think some of these actually created some opportunities. So I think just building on what you'd put out, that a crisis is sometimes actually the opportunity to push forward. And I actually think that maybe with a note of positivity, that the agenda has actually managed, particularly in the climate realm, has really managed to actually, I would say, be supported by some of what's happened. And I think there was a real strength moving forward out of the crisis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think there was one more request. Or yes, please, but be very, very brief if you can.
Thank you very much for the great input today. Dear Professor, very interesting and holistic approach to your research. My name is Christos. Actually, today is my first day here doing my internship, as I'm doing my 4th master's degree, and I have experience in wastewater treatment and solid organic waste management. So what we really experienced during COVID was the interesting phenomenon, social phenomenon, of which the dilemma between, which we didn't have seen for a few decades now, that of the dilemma between the human or environmental health. And that indicates to me that there is a lack of understanding of the importance of environment and its role to human health. I think what Mr. David talked about that earlier was that what was really common between all the countries, it was the inorganic solid waste generation, regardless the economic status. Perhaps that is an indicator of which shows us that when people take decisions, they don't really include in the decision-making criteria the environmental aspect. So I believe by investing in people and finding ways to incorporate in our future strategies ways to improve people's decision-making skills and perhaps critical thinking would, in our effort, would boost our effort to create a more cohesive and socially resilient society that would definitely, in my opinion, maintain the United Nations environmental agenda for next generations to come. This is what I wanted to say. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your contribution, and we finish with the voice of the next generation, the future generation. That's very apt. Yes, exactly. Can I invite the panelists maybe in reverse order for a quick, very quick 10 seconds max reflection at the end of this event? Please, Sepp.
Thank you, and thank you again for all of the questions and all the interventions. 3 points extremely briefly. We can achieve a lot during crisis. We just need to have faith and to roll up our sleeves, but crises are no excuse not to move forward on what is essential. This can be done if we retain the faith and confidence in multilateralism, and that requires states to really keep on committing systematically to intergovernmental organizations to deliver on their commitments, including in relation to finance and other aspects like this. And third, resilience can be really strengthened through the connections that are actually created and sustained through public participation. That's something to really focus on before the crisis and to sustain during the crisis at a level of priority that enables us then to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Seb. Dina.
Okay, so I would just say that I'm always struck that the tragedy of humanity is that we create crises to be able to advance and rebuild. So I find it's tragic, but in parallel, it creates opportunities, and we see partnerships at the key of the heart of the response. And then my last point, it's really about so much is about people and what they do individually and collectively. So once again, I want to close on how important the Geneva Environment Network is, that you have an amazing space there and amazing people that need to be recognized. I want to recognize Diana, who is the heart of that. And without the heart, the body doesn't beat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina. David?
Yes, and thank you. A couple of things just strike me. One is sort of the survival side, is which makes sure that you continue to do your core business, however that takes, and requires a lot of quick thinking and readdressing thing. And the other is sort of the flourishing side, where you grow through the crisis. And for us, it's linking to the issues that are really important to waste management, of course, is one that helped us to flourish within the Basel Convention context, but in linking to the other issues as well was really key. So I think both the survival and the growth are part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Agi?
Human-centered. If we want to keep the agenda alive, I think we need to take it from the perspective of people, because they need solutions that link together and not one thing. And that's where the systemic thinking comes together.
Thank you, Agi. Ambassador Tony, can I invite you?
Sure. Three short comments or conclusion. First, exactly we mentioned investing in the next generation, not only for now, but also for having specialists working on the question, and also specialists to be working in international organization and government to push again to know about what we're talking about. Giving the space to critical thinking, and especially the voice of the civil society, as you mentioned, and also open up, still working on also hybrid conferencing. It's very important to us. And finally, also, as you mentioned, this is exactly, we need to see concrete result for the citizens, for the population, and I think linking that with environment is key. And this is also the question of developing nature-based solutions for effective for the people. And then you will have I would say the democratic support for keeping environment top on the agenda.
Thank you very much. Professor Maertens, I think we've had a very rich discussion based on the first findings or initial findings of your research.
Thanks a lot. It's very difficult to conclude such an amazing panel. We received so interesting comment, and thank you everyone for engaging so deeply with what we've been trying to do. Maybe the final point of conclusion for me is how I started by looking at this, specific topic of agenda keeping, COVID-19, the environment, but it connects to much bigger question about the reform of the system, about how the system is structured, like it's fragmented, it's siloed, it's thematically organized, and the crises that we're facing today are actually transversal. And so how we can also build a new system that will be able to address this transversality in a way that doesn't create necessarily competition between issues. And I really hope that academia can bring something to that conversation in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Yes. Thank you again to all the panelists. to all the participants. Keeping the environment on the agenda in times of crisis, I think it's fair to say depends on all of us. So I hope you will stay part of this discussion even beyond this event today. Stay, please, also involved in the GEN's 25-year anniversary celebrations. We will have 2 events coming up. One has already been mentioned on the 2nd of December, where the focus is on pushing boundaries through collective climate action. That's an event at the Palais together with UNDP. Before that, on the 28th of November, the GEN will look at the journey from Stockholm to Rio and Geneva, 6 decades of enhancing collaboration in the fight against the triple planetary crisis, a roundtable with elders. And from my side, at the very end, a big thanks to the GEN team. It's indeed the beating heart of International Environmental Geneva. So a big thanks to Diana and the team. And again, to all of you for joining this event. Thank you very much and see you next time. And yes, and save the date for the big high-level event on the 20th of January next year. And panelists, please, to a family photo. Diana will tell us where.